right. Welcome, everybody. Hope you had a good, quick 5-minute break. And with that, we are ready for our next talk. So next talk, we're going to talk about what does it mean to kind of get more creative on building on top of Lens. And for this panel, we actually have three amazing people. So we have Rich, Ramon, and Simon from We3, and they're going to be talking about all the things that you can do and how you can extend your creativity with Lens. So without further ado, let's welcome all of them here on stage, and I'll ask them to turn their videos on, and I'll let you all get started.
Hey everyone, nice to meet you. I think should we just get started, Kartik?
Absolutely, yes. Also, you should flip the video on so the live stream can see you as well.
1 second, just going to the start of our slides. Okay. Give me 1 second. Can you see at least my slides for now?
Yes.
Okay. Okay. Cool. Shit. So, okay. Rich, Simon, are you guys ready too? So I can kick it off?
Absolutely. Go for it.
Good. Okay. Cool. So welcome everybody. Thanks for being. This is talk number 3, 4. So still staying with us, and excited to have quite a few folks here to kind of like listen to what we have brought to you today. Today it's a lot about kind of like what can you do with Lens, and how to think differently about what products or innovation you can build on top of it, and kind of like where this could lead. So I think we already heard a lot from Stani and Josh and David of like what Lens is. So I shortly just kind of like want to introduce us in the call, and maybe Rich and Simon, once you talk, you maybe can just introduce yourself very shortly, who you are and kind of like what you do. But I'm Ramon. I'm part of We3. We3 is a Web3 design collective. So we're a bunch of designers who realize that Web3 is growing exponentially, and it's one of the most interesting area for design to come in, because it's early, because we don't really know yet how to use it best, because it's still hard to use. And so we came together and we realized there's a lot of space for making the space more accessible, more inclusive, opening it up for the next generation of users. And we primarily do this through helping through product and brand strategy, product design and brand strategy, and really help kind of like building narratives from like early ideas to actually bring it to the market. Maybe a little bit of how we got involved in Lens, just to kind of like as a little bit of disclosure. We have been working with them since quite a while in the background to really shape the brand and the brand itself of Lens, but also kind of like help expand what Lens could mean for the ecosystem. I think Stani was saying is like, it's really about building an ecosystem. And so what we have been tasked to help out in the last few weeks is really kind of like pushing the edges of like what Lens could do in several places, and really help to kind of like shape that. So with that, I would love to shortly talk about why we believe, or I believe, social graphs matter, or what social graphs are. Being a designer in that space, I think it took me quite a while to understand what the hell is a social graph. Why does it matter? And we use the metaphor of kind of like, it's a little bit an iceberg. So like, we know social media, we know news feeds, we know friends lists, we know that it matters to have friends online, or being able to connect to them and like write with them through messengers, but it's really kind of like just the top of the iceberg that we really see here. And there's so much data and connections and content or connections that below the surface that are part of the social graph that are not really accessible for us, but they're also kind of like the bread and butter of like the traditional Web2 platforms like Facebook, Twitter, and all of that. So kind of like, I think for most people that come into this space talking about the social graph, it's really just kind of like the top of the iceberg. But like, what is really exciting is like what lies below that. And What we mean with that is like that basically everything has a social graph, right? When we started to explore Lens, it was a lot about like, is this social medias? Is this a new news site? Is this a feed? Is this a friends list? Like, what is it really? And the reality today is that basically everything that Web 2 touches, and potentially Web 3 will touch too, has a social graph, has a social component where we connect with each other, being it from sending and transacting from one wallet to one wallet, kind of like following someone's on-chain activity, to kind of like the more traditional Web 2 applications like Twitter or all of that. So when thinking about where Lens is going, I think one thing, oh, wrong button, is this is bigger than decentralized Twitter. I feel like when we start to ideate in this space, we often end up with decentralized Twitter, a new news site. It's like the go-to things. And we really wanted with this kind of like exploration and what we're going to show you today to kind of push what an open graph can enable for an ecosystem itself. What do we mean with this is that a social graph touches obviously social media and news feeds, right? It's about how a news feed is curated, what we're seeing there. But like when we start to zoom out there, it's as much about music, movies, and entertainment, right? We share playlists, we get recommendations, we play together, we watch things, let's play video on Twitch together. So it's kind of like all of those has a huge social component, how we kind of like connect with each other and do things together. And like that can be even broader in the sense of like in the realm of like matchmaking. So like it can lean from creators matching to create something together on TikTok through a duet, to kind of like actual matchmaking through dating, to finding collaborators in a DAO. So like a lot of those are built on social connections and doing that. So it's like Web3 is already inherently social, and we need to get to the next step there. And that can, and I think like when we think about where a social graph can be helpful, it's as much about social media, the metaverse, governance, shopping, working, gaming. It really can encompass all of this, which makes it sometimes really hard to start, but also kind of like shows hopefully how broadly applicable like a protocol like Lens could be. So with that, we wanted to kind of like highlight what are some core challenges that we think we can address through new experiences and new product design. And one thing is there's a huge chance to kind of like give more power or control to users. So we surrender, like with Web 2, Facebook, Twitter, Snapchat, you name it, TikTok, we surrendered a lot of power and control for convenience, right? We give away control over our data with sign in with Google, and now we have wallets. So like we're really kind of like in a state of empowering the user again, but like this empowering is also kind of like frightening, but like it's actually really kind of like a new paradigm shift for social media, that you're in control of your social graph, of your connections, and that you can shape it and control it. And that's quite a novelty. So like the question for us really should be, so how might we balance the control and the power that we gain with kind of like also ease of use through better UX and UI design here, so that we still get some of that convenience back. Number two that we think is super valuable here is like around insights. And the reality is we have a information asymmetry in the current social graph world, right? Platforms like Spotify, like Google, like all of that, they have a ton of data on us, and we might potentially even have access to that, but it's really hard for us to understand and acting on that. Like, so platforms often more know about ourselves than we do. And I think with opening up the social graph and all of that, again, this power of insight, this reflection and understanding can shift back to us. So kind of like, how can we use Web3 on-chain activity, this general more transparency in this space to give not just to create more trust, but like also more insights about ourselves. So what if those open graphs that we talk about kind of like really allow us to understand and reflect about ourselves, our communities in new ways? Next, I think it's important to kind of like acknowledge that Lens is a protocol, not a platform. And stole this one from one of my favorite paper called like protocols on a platform. But I think that this kind of like idea of like portability, that you're able to choose how you experience content, or being in control of that, or moving your friends list, or your friends list is moving with you and doesn't have to be established again, is quite a big change in like how we understand like open graphs itself. So this idea of portability is not novel for us, I feel, in Web3, where we have wormholes, where we have talk about cross-chain, and like we're trying to figure that out. But like this idea of like that social media is not a unique universe, a walled garden, but it's more like the Marvel Cinematic Multiverse, where things can coexist and connect with each other, I feel is quite a novelty. And like, so thinking about this, what we're going to talk about is kind of like leaning into the last point, is the more power we have, the more we understand ourselves and the data that's established through those places, and kind of like we create more portability, that allows us to completely rethink what a front end could be, like how we interact with it, right? It's like, if you don't like what data you get out of a front end, or if that could be more like you move on, you build your own. And like that is a quite novel approach to kind of like go, often also going a little bit more back how the internet was like a long time ago. So what this allows us to do, it's kind of like, it allows to kind of like lead with better design, because there's more competition, hopefully more choice. And like also, not everything has to be broad. You can also design for niches itself. So with that, that's kind of like a little bit an intro how we got excited about working with Lens itself, and like why social graphs matter. And I'm handing this over now to Rich and Simon to kind of like dive a little bit into some clusters of ideas that we had so far. Rich, Simon, I'm going to mute myself, but please free to move on.
Nice. Thanks, Ramon. Yeah, so we've got a few ideas that we've been tinkering on. You know, obviously it's such a big space, such a big area, so much opportunity of where to innovate. So where do we begin? Well, we've sketched out a few ideas that we'll share with you just to get the juices flowing. And you can consider these as kind of like interesting territories to explore. Some of them are really kind of like the natural breaking points of where Web 2 social media sort of breaks down, or where you might sort of find the cracks there. And other areas are really where sort of Web 3 enables us to create something net new. So you'll hear us talk a lot about what ifs. We'll be sort of posing a few questions. Really, these are just kind of prompts against which we think would be interesting to explore. So, let us know what you think, riff with us, ask questions, and throw ideas down in the chat as well. So let's dive right in.
Yeah, absolutely. You're going to hear a lot of what ifs from us for the next little while. So settle in. But we're kicking off with some ideas around lens tooling. Because when we're building something new here, something from the ground up, which means that we get to start pretty fresh, and we get to set up the tools and the systems that help us make the most of that sort of like green pasture of new social. The issue is right now, much of today's tooling for social is completely boxed off. It's like pretty hard or impossible to change or to interact with. So it's really exciting to start to think about breaking that and giving users the power of the tools that make the most of that new social. So we've been thinking a little bit about some tools that people can create to get the most of their Lens social graph. And if you give it a little scroll, now we've got one here all about verification. Because right now, verification is controlled by social media platforms and not really the communities that grow into them or grow to use them. And that can like stifle the innovation, or it can lead to even verification being a centralized platform's whim. Cough, cough, blue tick. So what if social media verification meant more than just being a real person? What if it instead sort of captured any kind of label that was meaningful to a community or to an individual or set of individuals? So like broadening this kind of this idea of verification to an extensible system of tags that could be attached to users, to communities, even to posts, would help us open up a rich new set of experiences. So again, some what ifs. Like, what if a distributed fact-checking community could tag posts that's researched and evaluated as like trusted? Maybe what if a curated collection of articles written by award winners could easily be created and automatically kept up to date? What if an idea could even be traced back to its roots and its tree of posts and replies, And lastly, what if a company's online profile could be tagged with its global carbon footprint? But speaking of influence and that sort of like sense of meaning to community, how about kind of getting a sense of where you as an individual community stand in your graph?
Yeah, so another thing we're sort of thinking about is really the, what's the default visual expression or sort of the visual viewing paradigm of your social media experience. And today, the typical, just to give it some context so you can sort of understand where the ideas are coming from, but the typical viewing paradigm really centers around like an infinite feed of content that's designed by the businesses and the platforms really to drive as much engagement and as much consumption as possible. And don't know if you guys have seen The Social Dilemma, but the guy that invented infinite scroll sort of often regrets kind of how that's led to a lot of mindless consumption. So things like your relationships and what you actually might learn about them seem to be things that are really like secondary features in today's social media experience. So you don't really see those things. They're just lists of contacts in secondary features. With something like the open social graph, though, I mean, I think what's interesting here is that because these experiences are being powered by that data, it's like this ever-growing model that's capturing information about your relationships with people, groups and communities and even businesses. Now that we would have ownership over that, what's also interesting is that we also have choice or possibility about how data is actually expressed or visualized. So, the question that we're exploring here is, what other ways could you express or visualize your social graph? What other new paradigms might we create to view your experience? And in this little illustration we've got here, My Digital Roots, we're imagining something more of an interactive graphical view. It's like a sketch, but of what your relationships look like. And this is something that could emphasize relationships over content. So you can imagine different filters and different toggles that you switch on and off to kind of, explore your network. But what else could it do? Perhaps it could actually help you see the degree of your influence or your reach, or even your exposure to different types of people from different groups. Perhaps you could also even see like timelines of your relationships and how your connections have flourished or diminished over time. And perhaps even understand more insightfully, like things like your frequency of contact or the dynamics or the interactions of your exchanges with others. So there's a lot of insight that can actually be drawn that we're not privy to at the moment in sort of Web 2 social media. And these are things that could be interesting. And when you sort of frame it in the idea of like, could you actually improve your relationships with people, it starts to become quite interesting. And then you think about what could this mean, not just to your friendship circle, but when you start to consider teams or professional networks, like what happens then? Yeah, to sort of like close out this little sort of territory, like Rich will sort of chime in now on what tools could be like to make the most of your experience with it.
Yeah, if you give us a scroll there, Ramon. Yeah, so right now, we're all using the web. And we're all subject to these really opaque algorithms that are kind of ruling the current social media experience. They're deciding what to show, or even what vanishes into the ether and what doesn't get seen by users. And we've got very little sort of influence over what we actually see because those algos are trade secrets. We're unable to show how the inputs and the interactions can influence the kind of contents that we might then consume. So what if we were able to have greater control over our feeds, over the way we consume different media across platforms, set our own rules, even our own standards, our own algorithms by which to kind of sort, filter and discover that content? Then the open graph not only allows anyone to build their own front-end experiences, but also perhaps the very engines themselves that define how content breaks through to the surface. You can infuse a point of view over which content should be prioritized and filtered based on different needs and different tastes at your own whim. So a few what ifs. What if you could choose from multiple open sourced algorithms or lenses by which you could view your lens feed? What if there are easy ways to manage permissions around what personal data a front end might use to personalize recommendations? Or what if those algorithms were like completely transparent and tunable to this point that you might even be able to jump in and sort of change a change a lever to see what you're viewing. And then this is a fun one. What if you could even flick a switch and have a completely different content experience, even like view the world through the eyes of your friends, celebrities, or like total wildcards from the other side of an echo chamber? But that's enough about those kind of foundations, that kind of tooling. What about what we should do specifically for creators?
Yeah, so I mean, obviously this is, when you think of Web3 and social media, it's very much synonymous with creators and the creator economy. And it just feels like there's so much potential to create new types of experiences for creators, but also for fans as well. And I think like we're interested in also how you can sort of foster connection from nuanced data around tastes and preferences. How can that inform and empower new types of connection between creators, but also between creators and fans? So if we scroll down a little bit, one of the things we're wondering about is the idea of collaboration and how matchmaking could serve greater collaboration, how Lens sort of might facilitate that. And to give it some backstory, I mean, today, creators around the world, they collaborate with fellow artists and writers and musicians and brands to develop fresh content. And often it's about furthering reach and actually growing audiences, as well as experimenting with different types of content. And you tend to find that it creates new dialogue, can bring communities together, and all that sort of good stuff. But I think what's sometimes challenging is how do you find and signal that you're sort of looking for this sort of collaboration, whether it's for like a project or for an art piece or for a DAO or for a brand. How do you find the people to work with? So the question we're exploring here is, how might we use our insights in the Open Graph to match creators together and catalyze new content and creative collaborations? So how do we make that seamless, sort of more easy? And we're thinking about tools for things like audience insight and matchmaking. So in our little sketch here, you can imagine a creator is seeing different types of potential matches or collaborators that are being served to them. And here we've got it kind of like a Tinder style, where you're seeing different types of folks perhaps matched on certain criteria or content or preferences, or perhaps it's about like how you're signaling certain project ambitions. And then next to that, like the idea of like this merged graph. So this is interesting when you have like a visual overlay. What if you could have two creators that could easily and perhaps visually compare and contrast their audiences to see where they overlap in tastes and preferences, but also to sort of see the gaps and the differences where they sort of might grow. So these are a few ideas just around matchmaking within the context of creators, but matchmaking, of course, is a theme that is going to run through lots of different verticals as well. So, what as you take this forward, think about like, what does this mean across different platforms, or even gaming, or finding collaborators in DAOs to start projects together, or even dating. But that's sort of a little bit about the creators. Now let's sort of think a little bit about the fans as well.
Yeah, what about flipping that about the sort of the fan experience? Because fan engagement is obviously huge for growth, and access to, maybe if you're a creator, access to the data about your followers, is pretty limited on today's platforms. It means that it could be pretty tricky to have sort of like valuable interactions, or even any at all discussion to understand the sort of your fans and your followers. Oftentimes it's even like fragmented across different channels, across different apps. And it's really hard to have a sort of central discussion to engage the sort of like feeling across different channels. So we're thinking about how might we provide creators with tools and resources, better understand their fans, even deepen their relationships, and really unlock the full value of their fan base. And thinking that on the flip side as well, how can we also like open it up for fans to basically get closer to the creators when, as their time is valued as well, and their engagement is valued. So like Lens could potentially enable creators to engage with their fans in any way they want, and really get a 360 view of their fan base, of their followers, maybe giving options to engage or to build connections that otherwise might not be possible. So like, as some just ideas, what if creators could really get reports and breakdowns on who their fans are, who's consuming the most content, what they love, what they like, who they're from, get a sort of holistic view of everyone that's involved. And then maybe on a recognition point, like what if creators could even recognize individual fans with rewards, perks, personal experiences maybe, and gifts, perhaps even some direct contact as a way to sort of thank them for that support, and show them that they're a valued fan. But then on to monetization. Over to you, Simon.
Yeah. So this one's really about monetization or commercializing content, and this is something that I think bugs a lot of creators today, and it's very difficult to find a way to have a viable, sustainable living on Web2 sort of social media. There's always a few issues at play. I mean, platforms take a large cut of any profits you make anyway. But also creators aren't always just free to focus on their content, because they have to worry about how do they beat the algorithm, how do they climb higher in the rankings in order to kind of better position themselves to monetize their content, and while also having to maintain towards community guidelines or guidelines and rules set by the platforms, which seem to be ever changing. So it's a sort of frustrating loop that I think a lot of creators get stuck in. So really it sort of feels that it's a system in which there are limits to the freedom of how you might sort of thrive both financially and creatively. So one question that we're thinking about for Lens and what it could imply for creators is really like, what if you could relieve some of that pressure, and what if you could put more control and better tools back into the hands of creators in how they commercialize their content, so they can both thrive financially and creatively. So, obviously with NFTs and the sort of the boom there, like creating content on chain is going to enable new forms of monetization, different systems, and also the way that could be tuned and targeted towards different audiences. Also, it kind of lowers the barrier for new creators to enter the system. They don't have to fulfill, minimum audience sizes and things like that to kind of actually participate and actually enjoy some revenue from their work. So a couple of ideas here, like one of them is this idea of a dashboard, right? So monetization dashboard, what if it was easy and simple for folks to automate or configure different options or systems by which to monetize their content. So in the sketch, you can kind of see, maybe it's an ad model, the traditional ad model that I switch on and I match made to brands. Perhaps it's pay-per-view or sort of surge pricing or even subscription. And on the right, perhaps I can just customize each post in different ways for different audiences. Maybe there's members I have or early bloomers, or just like, what is it for everyone else? But also, beyond this too, with content sort of minted, sort of released on chain, I mean, we're also imagining tools that can track content across apps built on Lens, so that creators can, monitor and track and receive income or royalties or attributions for any content that's used by other creators on Lens apps. And then the middle idea here is around membership, right? So obviously we're seeing this in different forms on certain platforms like Patreon, etc. But what if creators could design their own membership programs, and where they define the tiers of access and the different perks and rewards that their different audiences might have? And also, can they even pull in their audiences or their top fans into their kind of orbit and actually help them grow and incentivize those fans and audiences in different ways with financial rewards or tokens? So tons and tons of opportunities as it comes to monetization. And then now sort of back over to Rich for a little bit on DAOs.
Yeah, I hope everyone's clinging onto their seat in this avalanche of ideas. But we're getting there. But yeah, onto DAOs, because DAOs and collectives, they're like integral to the way of thinking, even the identity really of the sort of Web3 social world. But like oftentimes the tooling and front ends that we work with today, they're limited, for individual use, or potentially even the ones are sort of, there's less of a social aspect to them. It's more about sort of the hard financials or the governance, as we heard earlier. We've been thinking a little bit about how DAOs can have a sort of collective presence, giving them, almost like a social soul of their own on the social graph. So you give a little bit of a scroll there. There we go. Lovely. Yeah. So, like social media today really is built for individuals, and groups and companies like do have profiles. The user experience is, still orientated really around an individual person who controls the organization's account, or perhaps, maybe a team in bigger organizations and the like as well. And those platforms really are not set up at all for any sort of decentralized or ad hoc communities that may have, a range of ways of organizing themselves. They might not fit into these sort of strict buckets. So like, what if there was different voices in a community could come together under one profile, maybe one pop-up ad hoc profile, without giving any one person complete control? And we kind of have this, we have multi-sig crypto wallets where we can, let a group of people follow, a collective policy for transferring digital assets. So how about that for sort of a profile, if you like, for managing, a social presence of a collective? Yeah. What if a community could have a profile and a publication channel with a user interface that really suits its governance style, its tools? Maybe what if you could have pop-up sort of communities around these things? What if there was like local fans of taqueria in Los Angeles were able to compete to win the right to post a review under a shared account? And then what if digital native companies could easily distribute control of their social media feed to every single employee, so that everyone kind of has an ability to contribute to the presence on the web? And if you give us another scroll there, Ramon. Yeah, we've got this sort of sense of how you can make decisions about identity, but how do we sort of get a sense of the members beyond just a pseudo-anonymous address? And those have become obviously significant organizational structures in the Web3 space, bringing in completely new ways of organizing communities, treasuries, voting on change, distributing funds. But they're focused on right now maybe enabling the sort of those financials and the operations. They're becoming increasingly harder to manage, and they're becoming very fragmented and siloed across lots of different platforms. Like we all know the Discord problem. So what if DAOs were built on a suite of tools that really help to integrate not just governance and finance, but also a sense of identity and a sense of community and communication? And those on-chain tools for DAOs right now, they're typically centered around the voting and finance, like I mentioned, and they're by default sort of pseudo-anonymous with no identity, no sort of social presence attached to any sort of voting or anything. But what if you introduce sort of social connections between individuals and content represented on chain, then tools can expand to include that social and productivity features that otherwise, would exist, completely off-chain in other different silos. So what if DAOs had a dashboard for members that automatically showed the collective interests, maybe the authorship and the favorite content of its members? What if DAOs had a set of tools that enabled them to have one view of their operation, their communications, solving that Discord problem? And what if DAOs had more elaborate voting systems based on group membership, allowing some communities to run in sort of representative manners, perhaps, with boards of committees empowered to make certain decisions alone? Well, we just opened 3 sort of boxes just now, but there's a lot more to explore, and I'm going to ping it over to Ramon to take us home with the wildcard section.
Thank you. So that went broad. So we talked about kind of like the idea of like an open social graph and how empowering that can be. We talked about kind of like building potential new lens tooling that kind of like helps expand the ecosystem itself. We talked about kind of like the ideas or concepts that kind of like to evolve the creator economy itself. And we kind of like, we know that DAO tooling is a huge emergent space that needs a lot, kind of that is growing and thriving right now, and needs this social character. So kind of with those things, one thing where we wanted to end with or go now is like looking a little bit more in like, how could this manifest itself into front-end experiences or looking into that space? And so we have a couple of sections here that we want to run through a little bit to just inspire you to kind of like see how the world is already super social, but it can now, like where we can hopefully now put a Web3 twist on it or make it more Web3 native. And a big belief, we have a big belief that music is inherently social. We go to concerts, we share playlists, we have a deep connection to artists themselves, and like we want to we want to get be connected to them. We often are more willing to pay to an individual artist a significant amount than to kind of like to a service. So kind of like, how can we rethink the relationship between an artist and us, and create novel music platforms that take this Web3 mentality of ownership and relationship together, and kind of like build new primitives that enable new things to do there. I think it's also going there with the gaming world that is social by default, right? It doesn't matter if you play alone together with others around you in a game like Fortnite, Roblox, or all of this, but like those games become more alive if there are real people around you that you can interact with. But gaming is not just inside a game, it's like the whole world of Twitch, Discord, all of this kind of like economies and worlds around games itself, that like even in this chat right now, we have a chat going on the side where we have a conversation going on, and that we use the prompts to bring it into our live conversation right now here. So kind of like, how can we move from those very broadcasting tools to kind of like more interactive elements and conversations, and like that bring multiple worlds together in novel ways. So one way is like, how can play be even more social? Like, what would it be to build the iOS game center on top of Lens to easily find friends to play against with? Like, we all probably had our Wordle moment in the last couple of weeks, where we just kind of like also love to show off how good we were on Twitter, or not, as me, but like the idea is kind of like, we love those connections, we love to compete, we love to kind of like challenge our friends, and like a lot of this kind of gaming is super social. So but right now it's locked into specific worlds. So can we do this even make more social? And what this makes me also super interested about is like, I spent way too much time building up my GTA 5 character in GTA Online, and like that is a part of my identity too. What if an in-game character has its own social graph too? And how can we build those worlds around that? One thing that we haven't touched yet, but like we want to go back, is, yes, we talk a lot about Lens tooling and like DAO tools and all of this, but like e-commerce is one of the prime reasons the internet exists and thrives and grows. And like what we know from history is that wherever you establish a market, a community will build around it. No matter if it was the Silk Road, a marketplace in a Southern European city, that the whole town is coming together to kind of like exchange gossip and news and whatever happens around it. Like markets build culture, right? And like even like looking at like the marketplaces like Depop or Facebook, they're extremely social too. And I think we can go to the next level, like where we can actually see what our friends are up to, what our friends are recommending, what they are using right now or not using, where we can maybe get early access to it. And even like Rich was talking about rethinking algorithms based on our preferences, there's a lot of like ways how we can rethink shopping itself. And like, let's be honest, like Instagram turned into one of the greatest shopping malls in all time. So like shopping is social. So how can we gain the control a little bit more back and like using it for us? The other thing is, I think we sometimes miss that even the way we work and all of that is social too. This talk was created in Figma and FigJam, right? That's how we, at least as our team, are working. It's like you're following other people around in a file, and like you're building connections there too. So no matter if you use Notion, GitHub, Figma, or all of those tools, even Google Slides, there's a lot of like social elements and moments that we create. And I think, again, it's about kind of like making sure that you find your friends, that you can create new assets and all of that together. That makes it extremely powerful to think about, like, what does it mean when we have an open graph and we bring it together with the composability of Web3, together with the potential new business models that we can think through that come through DeFi and blockchains in generals, to kind of like create, like rethink work, social, gaming, and all of that together. I want to end with one of my favorite things is like, I think it's easy to get super heavy weighted in those conversations. And one of our like favorite ideas that we just want to leak here and show here is like around the ideas of memes. And a little bit background here is like, for me, when I think about TikTok or all of memes, it's like, this is Web3 culture. Like someone creates an expression and others start to build on it. Like memes are composable by default. Like that's how they work, right? We're building on top of each other and it creates this ecosystem of reactions and interactions and evolutions and all of those, like they grow. And like, so one thing that we start to think about, and even like just kind of like, how can we build a social network just around memes? And I think that just that for us shows the actual power of Lens itself, right? We could build the next evolution of Apple Music or Spotify. We can lean into it, building a social network, but it can be as small or nerdy as just a forkable meme creator on chain that kind of like shows you to build how your memes are spreading and evolving over time. And like that for me makes this super interesting. So to kind of like summarize where we ended with our thing is like, we started with that a social graph, we really just kind of like at the tip of an iceberg here, right? We talked about, it's really about empowering us ourselves. It's about kind of like that this is bigger than Twitter and Facebook and covers other things. And it's really about expanding what Lens can be, from visualizing our networks to rethinking about how we label things and organizing it through better algorithm. It's about kind of like better matching between creators, more insights from our relationships between fans and audiences, a new business model, and also kind of like the whole aspect of community itself. So this was a lot of talking from our side, and we hope that we at least could bring up the iceberg a little bit and like show a little bit more potential of like how big this opportunity actually is, especially when we start to cross connect the services that we build on top of it all together. I do think we have a couple of audience questions, so I think that's a perfect moment to kind of like close this conversation and like hear what are some questions. So let's freaking build this together.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for going through that amazing talk. And there's so many amazing comments on how well kind of thought out everything that you talked about is, as well as just overall the detail and the attention you put into preparing this. So it was super insightful. So I have a few questions I want to ask, and we'll kind of go to as many as we can until we kind of run out of time. But I guess the first kind of question that comes in is, from kind of your perspective, having been on both sides, like what do you think is a difference between being a designer in Web 2 and now in Web 3? Like, are there any specific things that stand out, or kind of how do you assess or contrast both?
I can take this one. I think like on a crafts level, it's not that much a difference, but what is different is that you have to think more about building for a community, building with others. You have to appreciate that everything is composable. Like if you design a brand, it's about, you have to embrace memes and that others will take the brand further. So it's a lot about giving control away and like enabling others. So I think on that one, on a product design lens, I think the reality is that we have to acknowledge we are still in a super early nerdy stage. It's very technical often. You have to understand some of the smart contracts fundamentals to kind of like especially in the more complicated like DeFi areas, to kind of like really push what design can do. And the reality is, I think there's just not as many of us designers out there. So you can't find that great inspiration first. So we need to find more of us to really push what design can do in this field.
Absolutely. And if anyone else wants to add something, feel free to go for it. If not, I'll move on to the next question. All right, cool. I'll do the next one. So kind of the other piece is you talked about essentially kind of how do you present information and what would be a good way to think about how Lens can make that easier. But what would you imagine sort of like the user ends up feeling? So I'll try and read this verbatim. So how do you imagine the users might feel different when interacting with a Web3 based social media network? Like what kind of different emotions do you think they might experience compared to the current social kind of norms or just networks out there? And do you think this is a different emotive experience too, or is it just a different way of thinking about where the data is and who controls it at the end of the day? And it's a bit of an abstract question, but
that is a great question. And I don't think it's one that we'll know the answer to until we start to build stuff, right? We start to put things in front of people and gauge reactions. But ultimately, I think it's hopefully we'll be evoking an interesting reaction. The whole sense of ownership really is what a huge piece is here. And hopefully a sense of, I guess a lot of trust has been degraded from some of the sort of bigger centralized sort of social media providers. And I'm curious to see, and at least from research that I've done on other projects, about how folk are sort of perceiving those current social media providers now versus sort of the newer ones, which are decentralized by default and sort of, have a lot of sort of trustless stuff baked in as well. So I think lots to see, but hopefully a little bit of interesting stuff against the backlash of the centralized incumbents.
I think two things to add. Like I really think the fact that you own your content and you're in control of it and you can decide what happens with it will change quite a bit how we think about how we create content, what content will be created, and how content is curated. I think we haven't touched that space enough, that creators are important, curators are the next big thing. The other thing is, like, I actually think rage quitting will be a superpower. As like, we're in the sense of, like, if your data is portable and you're in control, you actually, like, rage quit is actually something that can be a force for good, right? Where if someone builds a better user experience, a better way to moderate the content as you want it to see, that has better privacy section, it's not like you're locked into a system, you quit and move over. And I think that hopefully creates a lot of new competition and innovation of, like, actually exploring what this world even can be.
Yeah, big plus one to that. A lot of stuff that we heard from Lee, Stani, and Balaji earlier around this idea of, like, a race to create the best front ends, the most novel, the most interesting, and hopefully that's just going to drive great user experience, which we're all excited about.
Agreed. And we have the final audience question I want to ask, and then we can get to the next talk is, how do you feel about the real-time distributed collaboration sort of world in Web3? Do you think that's going to be interactive, like this call we're in, or do you think that's more on kind of the broadcasting side, where like Twitch, where people just kind of consuming what somebody's doing, but it's not really interactive?
Both. Honestly, I think that the reality is COVID and Corona, the pandemic, changed the way how we think about collaborating together, right? I was at IDEO before, and Post-its were my life, and now I haven't touched a Post-it for 2 years. And, like, I do this all through Figma, and it changed the way we work. Before that, I couldn't imagine it. And, like, the technology might sometimes still buggy, not there, but, like, I think real-time async, we find new ways, and we use it in appropriate ways, right? Sometimes we want to lean back and just enjoy Twitch, and sometimes I actually would love to kind of, like, be the annoying person on the side that can actually influence as an audience Twitch for the ones I'm watching playing. And, like, I think there will be new forms of interaction that can be enabled through those things. And, like, it's probably, like, it's not A or B, it's a gradient of things that we are enabling here.
Absolutely. Well, Simon, Ramon, Rich, thank you so much for that amazing talk. And this was great. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Everyone. Bye.